Welcome, everyone, to today's session, Mastering the Mind, the Revolutionary Psychology of Selling, where we delve deep into the art and science of sales through the lens of psychology. I'm your host, Steven Tedjamulia, Chief Editor of Social Lift, and today I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing Jake Stahl, a renowned Fractional Chief Learning Officer, certified NLP practitioner, and a trailblazer in the field of sales training and leadership development. Jake's innovative approach combines value-based selling with cutting-edge psychological techniques, revolutionizing the way we think about sales. Today, Jake will share his insights and experiences, shedding light on how understanding the human mind is not just beneficial, but essential in crafting a successful sales strategy. So without further ado, I want to welcome Jake Stahl to the event today. Thank you, Jake, for being here.
Oh, Stephen, this is quite an honor. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we really appreciate you diving into the psychology of selling. We're going to give the audience that we have a really big treat that Jake has offered. We're going to break it down into several major modules that, if adopted by sales people and their organizations, will help accelerate sales in a big way. So, Jake, I'd like to ask you a few questions to start out about the psychology of selling. Can you explain the basic psychological principles that underpin effective selling?
Sure. So, a big part of selling is trust. And I think I was in sales a long time. And I think in part, salespeople had made the bid that we're not to be trusted. It's rare that you hear trusted before the word salesperson. And so, a big part of the psychology of selling is establishing that trust before you do the pitch. So when you get on the phone or when you're talking with a client, or maybe you're even talking with a spouse and you're trying to get them to go out to dinner, a big part of it is having a lead up to the proposal. So if I can establish trust with someone on a call, and then I can gain that trust, and then I can use that trust to segue into my sales pitch, it makes it a lot easier than starting with the pitch itself. And frankly, Stephen, if you do your job well, your customer, whoever you're talking to, is actually going to ask you about you and your product. And that's the peak time to deliver your message.
So, for a salesperson who is trying to understand and apply the psychology of selling and the power of trust, what are some baby steps that they can start taking to help customers trust them? So, where do they get started? Give us some steps.
Yeah. So the first step, and I think it's the hardest one for any of us, no matter how much we practice, is just listening. And when I say listening, I don't mean listen to talk again or listen to compile a list of things you want to talk about and propose. Really listen. So focus on every word they say. And a great way to do this, Stephen, one of the great baby steps is to repeat back what somebody said in a different way. So if I'm talking to my wife and she says, we're going to have chicken tonight for dinner. And I say, okay, so you're going to be cooking dinner here at the house? She says, I'm not really sure. So would you like to go out? So the big way to do that, Stephen, is to listen and explore what they're saying. And a great way to do that is just to repeat back little tidbits and do this regularly. Because what you're going to find happens is the more you repeat back to them, the more they like you. And the more they like you, the more the trust builds. Because here's a big psychological piece. People do not like a conversation with you. They like you. Any good feelings they get from a conversation, they attach to you. So every word you say, Stephen, from the time somebody picks up the phone, you're setting a precedent for further in the call. I once heard it that people decide in the first 8 seconds whether they're going to give you the next minute of their time. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Whatever you say sets the precedent for things that are going to be said later.
No, that is great advice. So repeating back, listening to person, repeating back. Now, what are some misconceptions on trust that people may think, oh, I'm actually doing this and it's helping me build trust, but maybe it isn't, right? So Any common pitfalls or misconceptions that you can share?
Yes, one big one is silence does not mean understanding. And I hear this a lot of times with the clients that I work with is a representative will be on the phone and they will ask a question or they will talk to the client and there will be dead silence. And so the salesperson will think maybe I'm not going fast enough. They obviously understand what I'm saying or else they'd have a question. So then they speak faster and that instigates more silence. So they speak faster. So one of the big pitfalls I warn everybody about is just because somebody doesn't ask a question doesn't mean they understand what you're saying. And a great principle to follow to feel this out with your customer is what I call the 210 rule. That means for every 10 minutes you present anything, whether it's to a significant other, a friend, or a potential client, for every 10 minutes you present, the human mind generates about 2 minutes worth of questions. My job when I'm presenting is to eliminate those questions as I go. Because Stephen, what happens when you have a question in your head about a presentation and they just keep talking? Does that question nag you the whole
Oh, it
time?
does. Yes.
So if I can get that question out of the way and I can answer it, you're going to be more open to the conversation. So the 210 rule says every 2 minutes, check in with the person you're talking to. Make sure they're following along. Make sure they understand. At the end of 10 minutes, wrap up what you just talked about. So Stephen, you and I have just been talking about for 10 minutes and I've just been gabbing the whole time. So anything I said that doesn't quite make sense? Or have you followed along with everything that I said? So Stephen, by giving these little interjections along the way, you'll avoid the pitfall of thinking that they understand when you really lost them 5 minutes ago.
That is a great misconception that you resolved and helped provide a solution for. So trust is the first misconception that we've talked about. Is Let's talk about connection a little bit. You mentioned connection as a strong other psychological tool that can be used. How important is the art of connecting in sales? And what techniques do you find that help build this rapport with clients?
Sure, great question. And this is really the foundation of neurolinguistic programming. This is really what NLP is all about, is establishing that rapport right away. And one of the best ways to do is to understand a person's modality. Do they think visually? Do they think auditory? Do they think kinesthetic? What does their language say to you? So if you and I are talking, Stephen, and you say to me, hey, visualize a tree in a field, tell me about the experience. And I say, wow, I see a lot of leaves and the sun shining and the waves of grass are blowing. The way you want to communicate with me going forward is to continue to let me visualize. Use phrasing that says, can you see that happening? Do you see what I mean? What does that look like to you? So anything that connects that way. And that's where the magic happens. If I can determine if someone is visual, auditory, or kinetic, and I talk to them in those same terms, we start to form a bond. The brains look at each other and go, wow, they're a lot like me. And we all tend to like people who are like us. So one of the first goals is to mirror someone verbally. The second way is visually. What is that person doing? Are they sitting forward? Are they sitting back? Are they meeting your eye gaze? Are they looking away? Do they have their hands folded? And can you mirror them visually? And this is traditionally what people think about in mirroring is, oh, I just do what they do. But it actually goes much deeper than that. It goes into verbal rapport, physical rapport, and that leads to mental rapport. So those are great trust building techniques. And Stephen, don't get me wrong, this takes practice. When I work with a client, I give them a 21-day challenge. Each day of those 21 days, they need to think about a different part of this, what we call the VAK modality, and determine what's their modality, and then to practice enough that they can tell what the person they're talking to's modality is. Again, this takes practice. This is stuff we need to learn and be conscious of.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense of how that connecting techniques you shared can really help build that bridge with the client. Now, if someone's really struggling with this and they're like, "Oh, I hear you. Those are great steps, but I need some help getting started. It takes some time." Any tidbits of little things they could do right away that would get them that connection to overcome their struggles with connecting with clients?
Yeah. And what's funny, you can actually start with this by a picture. So think about your Zoom profile or think about your LinkedIn profile where you have a picture. Psychologists have actually pinpointed three parts of a picture that help you establish trust before you even talk to them. So the three parts of a picture that matter the most are the tilt of your head. So your head should have just a slight tilt to it in the picture. The second one is a big smile, obviously, because the smile is warming. And the second one is to lean forward just slightly. But those have actually been determined to establish trust just through a picture alone. If you need hints on how to do it when you start talking with someone, part of it is be interested. Let your tonality express that you're interested. A smile on your face equals a smile in your voice. People can hear when you're smiling. And when you're actively interested and you ask them questions, you'll be amazed at how trust is built. I'll give you a great example. When I do my reach outs to people normally, if I haven't met them before, my first 3 or 4 reach outs are just about them. I never talk about me or what I do. And we get to a point in the conversation, Steve, where they will say, "Well, I talked a lot. So tell me about you." And at that point, their interest is piqued. So I know what I'm going to say is going to get through. But to get genuine interest, you need to give it. That can start with your picture.
Oh, that's great feedback. Your picture and then the interest level. So we covered trust, we covered different best practices to connect. You also alluded a little bit to understanding the person, understanding the buyer motivations and need. How does understanding the psychology behind the buyer's motivation change the sales approach that someone's going to use?
The best way to describe this is think about when you get a phone call on a cell phone from a person that you may not want to talk to. So their picture comes up, their number comes up, and the first thing you think of is, "Oh, I don't know if I have time for
Right.
this." Right? Those people, it came to your head right away, didn't they? So the thing we need to understand about a buyer's motivation is it starts when the phone rings. We often think, hey, this starts when I say hello, but it doesn't. So, Steve, you're sitting down to dinner at night. Maybe it's 7 o'clock and your phone rings. What's the first thing that goes through your head?
I don't have time for this. Probably telemarketer. Let me check.
Yeah. And if it's family, you think, oh my God, it's an emergency. This is a weird hour to call. So you already have a preconceived notion and you've been conditioned to act a certain way. There's a psychologist from the 80s and 90s. His name was B.F. Skinner. And he said, free will is an illusion. All we are is one big set of preconditioned responses that we've used in the past and have been successful. So when we use the phone example, we can see how that conditioning kicks in. Other examples are if I say to somebody, how are you? What's the response? Fine, thanks. How are you? If I say I love you to a family member, what's their response? I love you too. We're conditioned. When we think about the willingness of the buyer or the readiness of the buyer, we have to factor in what's their lens for the day. When they picked up the phone with me, what's their conditioned response going to be? And my job as a salesperson is to break that conditioning. It's to make sure that they're listening through my sincerity. So the buyer may have been ready for me the day before and in a great mood and ready to listen. And today, maybe not so much. So again, I think we shift back to the first tip I gave, which is when they get on the phone, give a different introduction than, hi, how are you? And show that you're actively listening and listen to where your buyer is. You can tell their motivation in the first couple of minutes. Just listen for all the key signs. They're willing or they not? Are they in a good mood or a bad mood? How did they pick up the phone? What were they expecting from me? And work from there.
Now, if the buyer's motivations are not clear immediately, what are some strategies a salesperson can take to better understand those?
This is going to sound repetitive, and I certainly don't mean to sound so, but one great way is to repeat things back to them as they talk. It's called eliciting information, and it's doing it empathetically. So let's say a buyer, let's say I'm selling health benefits, and a person says to me on the other end of the phone, I hate this time of year. We have to renew our health benefits every year at this time, and I just hate it. So my response might be back to them, it sounds like a tough time for you. Then that elicits more information. Yeah, this is really a tough time. I don't like doing this. So what part of it don't you like? So again, I'm just repeating back. So I can find out a lot from them just by repeating back the information that they're giving me. At one point or another, and it doesn't sound like it's a case, but at one point or another, they're going to say to you, so what are you offering? What are you calling for? And by that time, as a salesperson, I want to have gathered enough information that I can propose a solution that fits their problems. And this is nothing different. A lot of salespeople say find out their pain points. My suggestion, Steve, is just take it from a psychological perspective and let them give them to you versus you asking for them.
That
Does
makes a
that
lot
make
of
sense?
sense. And I know empathy is an important role as you're trying to understand the buyer's needs and motivations. Can you explain a little bit about the power of empathy and why that's so important?
Yeah, so a lot of people confuse empathy and sympathy. And the best way to think about that is let's say you're in a mall parking lot. I don't even know if anybody goes to a mall anymore, but let's say you're in a mall parking lot and you see somebody with a flat tire across a parking lot. Sympathy is, oh, that poor sucker, he's going to have a rough night. And you get in your car and leave. Empathy is driving over to that person and saying, hey, listen, I feel your pain. Is there anything I can do to help? So there's a subtle distinction, but oftentimes these are confused. Empathy puts you in the boots of the other person. And there's a lot to be said for that, right? Because what's our favorite thing to talk about
So,
is ourselves,
yeah.
right? So when somebody else takes interest in me and wants to walk a mile in my shoes, I start to get a psychological bond with them. The biggest psychological motivator we have is reciprocation. So when I empathize with somebody, most of the time people want to reciprocate by empathizing back to see what they can do for me. And a great example of this is with people who love cop shows. When they get somebody in the interrogation room, they say, can I get you a coffee? Do you need a cigarette? The whole idea behind that is the reciprocation. You gave them something, they'll give you something. In real life, empathy triggers that reciprocation response. Hey, you really reached out to me. You really wanted to help me. So what can I do for you? And that opens up a whole new line of relationship building with a potential client.
No, I love it. I think so far you've broken down trust, building this relationship of trust, how to connect, understand the buyer through rephrasing what he says, and then creating empathy so he can have that stronger connection. So far, these have been great strategies for sales reps. Let's talk a little bit about ethical influence in sales. This is ethics influence is powerful. How do you define ethical persuasion in the context of sales?
That's an amazing question. And I get asked this a lot. People say, where does this cross the line into manipulation? And it's a perfectly valid question. And manipulation deals with ethics. And I think part of it is I often heard salespeople, and I know a lot of them, they always say, I can't sell a product I don't believe in. Ethically speaking, I think we owe our customers a lot. We owe them active listening, active empathy. And when you start to go beyond that and you use neurolinguistic programming technique or psychological techniques to just break down barriers, I think it crosses the line ethically. I think we made a tough bet as salespeople. So we always talk about car salespeople. The car salesperson will do anything to get you into it, name a certain tactics to get you to sign the contract, and they go to talk to their boss and they don't really talk to their boss. I think that's the picture we paint. But the reality is there's a subset of car salespeople that are extremely honest and they're trying to earn a living like you and I. So ethical sales has a lot to do with just doing the right thing for both parties. I want to sell a product because I have a living to make and I believe in the product I sell. But we also need to put ourselves in the shoe of the person on the other end of the phone. Do we like to be taken for a ride? Do we like to be railroaded into something? And Steve, if we look back on sales techniques from the 70s and 80s, you can see that a lot. Movies like Cadillac Man or Tin Man, story about the guys who sold aluminum siding. And you see a lot of tactic used to get to people to say yes. But I think that crosses an ethical line. And if you genuinely show interest and they genuinely want to buy, I think that's a far more potent sales technique than using a script designed to wheedle you in the back door, so to speak.
Now, is there a time when ethical persuasion was particularly challenging but ultimately successful? Do you have an example of where sticking to the right will get you through and not crossing the line?
Yeah, I think part of it is I see this a lot, Stephen, in my own business every day, is there's multiple opportunities in any given week for myself or one of my clients to try to get something just because you need it. My coffers are dry, so I need to make that sale. And I think time pans itself out to say that if you continue to plot in the right direction, you're going to make the sale that you need to make and you're going to make it in the right way. And I'll give you a good example. I was a sales trainer for 16 years for a corporation. And one of the things I did was I trained all new sales reps on how to sell pharmaceuticals. And there's certain like hidden arguments here, right? There's nothing ethical about pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of sub groups arguing about this. But recently, I was trying to get a new client and they hired me, and they hired me because of somebody I trained 15 years ago in the pharmaceutical industry. And I trained them right and I gave them the right things to do in an office. And we never crossed that line into getting outside the package insert. So I think there are times we'll look at something and we'll say, wow, I didn't get an immediate result, but you'll get a result years later. I think ethics pays for itself. This might sound new agey, but I think the universe rewards those of us who do the right thing for the right reasons. And so to me, ethics is of utmost importance.
No, I agree completely, and I think from a sales perspective, keeping to the trust, the ethic, doing the connection, empathy, these skills that you're teaching today will make the sales rep so much stronger. And and also, like you said, it'll pay up dividends in the future. It may not be right away, but things will happen. One thing that comes up a lot with salespeople is objections. There's a lot of objections, roadblocks to get the sale done. So overcoming objections and the psychological approach to do that becomes very important. Objections are often seen as a roadblock. How does psychology help overcome them? Any strategies you could share
Well,
with us?
yeah. And here's something that I teach all the time is that somewhere buried in every statement is a question. So if you look at a great way to practice this is look at somebody's LinkedIn post and read one of their blogs. When they make statements, there's questions buried in there, and this applies directly to the objection. So if somebody is selling me, let's say, new shingles for my house, and I say, I can't afford it, that's a statement. But buried inside there, Stephen, is a question of, can you do this so I can afford it? If we think about objections as questions, it opens up a whole new thought profile in it,
Okay.
right? So somebody says the price is too high. What they're really saying is, I love it, but can you help me afford it? Or this contract is too long. So what they're saying is, I'd love to do this, but can we make the contract shorter? So when every objection is a question. And the cool thing about this is that if we do our job, if we put all of our cards on the table and they come back with an objection, that in my mind is always a buying signal. Always. I never take an objection as they're done. So I always ask myself in that statement, what's the question? And then I answer it or try to answer it. Doesn't always work out well, but I tried to. So my argument, which a lot of people are going to disagree with, is price is never an objection. Price is always an invitation to make the value higher so that the price is acceptable.
So, as someone has an objection and a sales rep says, "Great, man, Jake, you open up my mind. This helps so much." So, when I get an objection, what do I do? What is it? What should I ask them a question once they give me an objection? How do I turn that objection into the buying opportunity?
So another great question. And the whole idea of giving an objection, if somebody didn't want the product, they would presumably find some way to just say no. And I'm not ruling out that multiple objections is a shy person's way of saying no, but usually objections are an invitation to move on. So the way to do that is what we alluded to earlier, and that you search for the question in there. So let's give an example of pricing. This price is way too high. The question is, the price is high, but how can I afford this? Or I don't see the value in it. Can you tell me the value? So when we go back and we think about this, we want to think, wow, so I haven't provided enough value. And are there ways I can help the person afford it? A good way to deal with objections is to think about all the different objections a customer may have. And I hope companies do this. I have them lay out all the objections a customer can have. And then we come up with multiple answers for each and what the real question they're asking is and what the answers are. And part of this, Steve, is rehearsal, knowing your product, knowing the benefits, knowing the payment plans, understanding the value. Another part of it is practice. These aren't things people pick up overnight. I hearken back to when we think about kids, they have conversations real easy, right? They talk and ask questions always. That's my mom, which is yours. I like black. What do you like? But when we get into sales situations, we're looking for an immediate result and our ability to converse diminishes. My advice to people on answering
And
objections is to role play it out with people.
no, I love it. I love that a lot because it helps you then show the other skills of trust, empathy, be able to repeat the question. But if you know those objections, like you said, and you've written down before, probably know what's in their head to know how to proceed forward. So I love that approach to objections. Going on a little bit to the creating high impact presentations and pitches. I wish we could spend more on all of these topics and these strategies. And for those that are listening, this is a great time to reach out to Jake directly. Reach out to us. We'll connect you to Jake where you can get the training. You can work through the scenarios with them directly. But talking about presentations and pitches, what makes a sales presentation or pitch impactful from a psychological perspective?
There are four things a person wants to understand about a product most of the time. It's hard to do 100% sweeps on these things, but most of the time from a psychological side. The first is they want to understand that it fulfills their dream outcome. So the ideal that they have in their head, how close does this product come to filling that dream outcome? And part of this is part of discovery, right? When a rep does discovery, they try to understand what exactly is it that you want. The second piece of it is how did the person come into the call? What was their perception of this call being successful and the product being exactly what I wanted it to be? So a salesperson, we never sell the reality, we sell the perception. So are we filling that person's perception? So the first two components are, do we understand their dream outcome? And do we understand what their perception is of what they're getting and how it fills their perceived needs? The third piece, Steve, is the time slot. How much time is it going to take between the time I buy your product and I see results? So it's like the delay. Is it going to be months, years? What's it going to be? I'm giving you a grand today. What do I bet? Like immediately right now. And the last piece is how much effort and sacrifice do I need to put into this? What exactly am I going to need to do to make this a successful transaction? So in a powerful presentation, we show how it fills their need for a dream outcome, how it meets the perception of their needs, how quickly they're going to get a benefit, and how much effort they need to put into it. If we can hit all those things, we're going to have a very impactful presentation. And then, of course, there's the stuff that's on the side, like third-party testimonials and things like that. But if you can hit the key four, you're on your way to having an amazing presentation.
Oh my goodness, those are the great outline of what needs to be done. And I imagine customers may be wanting to share their existing pitches with you to see if they fit into those. Let's talk a little bit about the tactic of storytelling in sales pitches. How effective is that? Do you recommend? Is it part of the psychology?
Yeah, and this is a really cool part, Steve. And this is something that could be like all day talk. Think about going back to the caveman days. What was one of the things they did that we can see today?
Drawings.
They made cave drawings, right? They told a story. And what's really cool is they didn't just tell a story to others, but they gave themselves the ability to relive that story by looking at their own artwork. Then you go through hieroglyphs, you go through paintings and sculptures. There are a million ways to tell stories, music, movies, and we're all engrossed in them. Binge watching is our commitment to watching a story and relating to it. So storytelling is inherent to our basic psychology. Think about it this way. If you're a golfer and you buy a driver that's going to give you an extra 10 yards on your drive, you don't ever just buy it and not tell anyone. If you didn't tell anyone, what's the point of buying the driver? You might as well just continue to drive short. But the first time you do that drive 10 more yards, you're going to be like, I got to tell my buddies. And here's a selfie of me doing it. And I took a TikTok and it's out there. Social media in itself tells you that telling a story is everything. Music tells you that. Movies. Rotten Tomatoes was founded on that. If a movie has a bad Rotten Tomato rating, they're saying they told a crappy story. So our foundation of what we do is based on stories. And anytime you can bring a client into the story of how your product will help them, your chances of closing the sale go up dramatically.
Oh, that's great.
I know that was long-winded, but I'm very
No,
passionate
that
about
is
this.
one I wish we could spend more time on. And just this section is such a great section to the podcast. I only have three more sections. I don't want to skip them because I think they're so important. What are the key emotional triggers that people should aim to hit in their presentations?
The key emotional triggers are going to be the ones that are be most conducive to the sale. So one thing I want to do is I want to understand what their pain points are. And that can bring up some tough emotions, right? If you're selling life insurance, the pain points are going to be a lot differently than if you're selling a vacation rental. So I want to tie into the pain point that they have and whatever emotions that brings up. Not to manipulate them, but to let them live through what their needs are and associate with it. This is another part of neurolinguistic programming is dissociating versus associating to an emotion. I also want to tie happiness and good feelings in with the purchase. And I want to have somebody picture themselves with that purchase. If you go to buy a timeshare, all you're going to see is pictures of you in a paradise. All you're going to see are the best rooms they have to offer. It's only after you buy the timeshare that you realize you bought into the lowest possible room. But we sell victory, right? We sell happiness. And that's a key emotion, but you want to tie that to the ownership of the item. They're going to be happy when they purchase your product and are actively using it. And if you're an ethical salesperson and you have a product that's can fulfill those needs, you'll be like a member of the family. Where the saying comes from, I got a guy. Oh, you need a suit? I got a guy. It's because the salesperson bonded with them, was trustworthy.
Oh, yeah. Great. I have two more to ask you in this section here. Any tips to share for visual aids or other material in the way you present as we discuss the art of psychology selling?
Yeah, so people respond well verbally, but remember, we only remember a small portion of what we hear. As a matter of fact, Steve, once you and I get out of this interview, in 2 hours, we're going to remember 20 or 30% of this whole thing. Visually, your brain remembers a lot more. But if I can tie the verbal to the physical, the difference is astounding because I'm tying together two modalities. And if you remember, when we talked about neurolinguistic programming, it's about modalities. So the visual modality and the auditory modality tie together to basically cement memories into our minds. If we could tie in kinesthetic and get them to actually feel it, feel the product, touch the color, touch the plant, feel the warmth of the vacation spot, then you have an amazing three-way hit into the memory. It's just the way the brain works. The different modalities we use, the more we can use, the more we remember.
That is well said for the visual aids. It's bringing me up so many different thoughts of how I can improve my own presentations. One more question here is tailoring presentations to match the psychological profile of your audience. How do you do that? How do you think ahead and then match it so you have the biggest impact?
There's a lot of different answers to that, but let's just talk about one of the basic ones is think about the occupation of the people you're selling to. If I'm selling to accountants, I'm going to want to sell to things that are very direct. I'm going to want to show charts and tables and numbers because they're organized and they're sequential. So I'm going to want to make sure I gear my presentation to that. If I'm selling to a nurse, I may want to give a more visceral sell. I may want to give something that they can relate to and they can feel and they can understand. If I want to talk to a doctor, I think in terms of bottom line results. So I may want to keep my meeting brief and my presentation brief. So I would highly encourage that whenever we go to do a sales presentation, we think of the occupation of what do people do and try and relate it to their occupation. So I'm not saying if it's a doctor, you give them biology. I'm saying if it's a doctor, think about the way they learned in med school and start to mirror that and use that in your presentation. Because if I go to an account and I give them a light and fluffy presentation, it's not going to have near the impact. And this kind of goes back to what we started with, was mirroring what they're used to hearing, the words that they like to use, and the way they like to learn. So that's just one way, Steve. You could spend a couple of days on this, but that's one of the biggest ways.
No, thanks for sharing that and diving into it just a little bit. There's a concept of an adaptive conversation with your audience. It's a blueprint. Can you explain a little bit about this powerful approach?
Yeah. So a lot of times when a person gets trained on how to sell, they're trained with a script. And they're trained that you have an opening, a presentation, answering objections, and close. But life doesn't really work like that, right? We don't talk to a significant other like that. We don't talk to a friend like that because our brain doesn't normally work like that. So the adaptive conversational blueprint basically says that you adapt on the fly. So after I have my greeting with a person and I take that couple of minutes to really get to know them, I adapt to where I go next. When I get a telemarketer that calls me, if I throw in a really weird question, are you reading from a script? It throws them right off. A lot of times they don't even recover because they're so rigid in the way they do things. I'm not criticizing telemarketing companies, not at all. But what I'm saying is a better approach is to understand that every conversation we have takes twists and turns. Think the last time you talked with a friend and they were happy one minute and crying the next, or You talked with your mom or dad and they were thrilled to hear from you, but they had a gripe. So it really shifted and went the other way. Adapting on the fly, in my opinion, is the only way to sell. And scripts don't typically allow you to do that. They're a great foundation, great place to start from. But if we don't have a blueprint from getting from A to Z to starting by understanding the person, flowing with the conversation, introducing our product at the right time, and then asking for the close at the end, it's not going to work out as well. Your close rate is going to be lower. And I've seen this time and time again. I've just worked with a company to do this, and we 3x their sales using this very approach.
Let's talk a bit about a sales rep that's struggling to go from a script to adaptive conversation. What are some baby steps they can take in that jump? So it's not too big of a jump, but something they can manage and be successful in.
One of the things they can do is when they get involved in a conversation is just change one piece at a time. This is a reason diets fail, isn't say, okay, eliminate all these foods and use this food and you're going to be fine. But it's too big of a leap for us to make. So one way can be just changing your greeting. One suggestion I would make is when they get on the phone is don't say, hi, how are you? Nobody wants to hear, how are you? And it screams that you're a sales representative. But a way to break that conditioning is to go, wow, thank you for picking up. I was really looking forward to talking to you. My name is Jake. It breaks that conditioning right away. Once the rep gets familiar with just making that subtle shift, then the next thing is to pick something out of a conversation and casually repeat it back or ask a question about it. When they get comfortable with that, then they move on to the next step. But when you're learning something like the adaptive conversational blueprint, you have a 1 hour class, and then you have a week to practice one tiny step in the process. Then you have a 1 hour class, then another week to practice a tiny step. Steve, we weren't meant for stellar leaps. Our brains weren't meant for stellar leaps. We were meant to bit chunk information, practice them, and then learn new information based on our new foundation. So those little bits and pieces can help somebody get off their rent ground and get started and feel natural.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. This is such an insightful discussion. I think you're an expert. For sure, you're an expert or a top expert in this field. And we thank you for that, for your time and answering these questions and sharing these strategies with us. There's one strategy, the last one I'd like to dive into, which is the psychological strategy for sales team motivation and leadership. How do you keep them motivated? How do you keep them successful moving forward? What is the psychology behind motivation and sustained success for a sales team?
Here's the interesting thing about motivations. We always talk about motivational speakers. And when it comes to a motivational speaker, they can motivate you, especially while you're in the audience. But the hard part is that motivation dies after a very brief period of time. We buy their kit and we go home and we try it and it doesn't work overnight. And so we tend to set it aside. So one of the basic psychological tenets of motivation is it needs to come from internal. We need to find ways to motivate ourselves. And a good sales manager or a good CEO of a company will understand the motivation for each person. Let me ask you a question back, Steve. What motivates you to do this every day?
Motivation is it's something I love to ask questions. I love to learn, and love to help other people become successful. And that desire for helping others, as I wish I could have been helped as I started my own companies, is something that just feeds me to want to do more. Does that answer your question?
The way I would coach you or talk with you would be much different than the person who may say, listen, money's my
Yeah.
jam. I want to make $1 million this year, and I want to take that approach. So I think it's incumbent upon sales leadership to not assume that a raw speech is going to affect everybody. We need to know everybody's individual motivations and what makes them get out of bed in the morning. Because again, psychology says you can be motivated, but that motivation doesn't last. The motivation that does last is that comes from within. And honestly, that's a deep question for a lot of people. Some people aren't sure why they get out of bed in the morning, and a good sales manager can help them bring that to the surface.
Oh, that's great. Understand each of your salespeople, understand what gets them moving forward and how to help them. That's core to be able to make them better and to help accelerate the sales in your team. We really appreciate we're coming up here on time. I want to give everybody a chance. You become an expert. You shared your expertise. Like we can tell that you're one of the best in the field just from the way you've answered the questions and what you shared for us today. What got you here? Tell us about your background of how did you get here, and then how can people reach out to you and get more advice?
Sure. So I grew up in a generation where kids were to be seen and not heard. And my dad was a very prominent businessman in the community. He had his own business. It was a small community. He was the head of several organizations. So I got to sit in on, I would argue, hundreds of business meetings between him and colleagues. And as a kid, I didn't appreciate it at all. And as I grew up and as I got into business, it started to really occur to me that there were a lot of conversations he had that were successful and a lot that were really just failures. And it sent me on a quest to try to figure this out and to try and get deeper into it. I'll be honest with you, I had a marriage that failed, and a lot of that was me not understanding all the time or being able to communicate as well as I could have. So I think part of it is growth as well as understanding what my dad went through as a business person, wanting to be successful. And what keeps me going, Steve, is the fact that there's no great answer. There's no set rule book you can just apply and walk away and say, yep, mastered it, I'm done. One question I get all the time is, you teach communication, are you any good at it? And the answer is no. The answer is I do okay and I can hold my own, but I make a lot of mistakes and each day is a new day. So that's what keeps it thrilling. It's like trying to learn chess. Once you make the first 5 moves, there's a billion alternatives and nobody knows every alternative. So it's just a fascinating thing to continue to improve with. And if I can help people be better in their business and sell better by helping them understand when I didn't, that's a win. That's a
That's
big
a
win.
great win. And how can people get a hold of you? What if they are interested? Tell us a little bit more about your service. How does it start? Give them a little preview of that.
Sure. You can obviously reach me on LinkedIn. That's my only social media. Or you can reach me on my website, which is jakestahlconsulting.com. But anytime I get a call from somebody, you get a free 1 hour interview. We just sit down and we talk it out. I'm not for everybody. Not everybody's for me. And so we determine how we can best move forward together. And if I can't move forward with somebody, I will introduce you to the people I think you can move forward with. I'm a firm believer, Steve, that you get what you give. And I love to connect people as much as I like working with them. So the first thing you can expect from me is 1 hour, no pressure. And then at the end of our call, we'll have a set game plan forward of either progressing together or I will get you in touch with someone that will help you. But I don't know many companies that offer you 1 hour free, but I'm more than willing to do that. And you can do that right on my website or you can book an appointment on my LinkedIn site.
For those listening, this has been an amazing session. I hope you took a lot of notes. You can refer back to this at any time. We'll put the transcript up. We'll also have a training built out for this with a couple articles based on this discussion. And you please reach out to Jake or contact us and we'll set up an appointment with Jake. It's been very enlightening. I think from any salesperson listening, they probably took a lot of nuggets away that they can improve their day and practice those and then even reach out for more for Jake. Jake, I appreciate you sharing these strategies, trust, connection, empathy, searching within yourself for motivation, being able to have these adaptive conversations with people, creating high impact presentations. We've gone really deep and we're very thankful for your presentation today and for sharing this with us.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you as well, and thank the audience. And with that, we'll end.